Welcome to Free Thoughts from libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute. I'm Aaron Powell.
And I'm Trevor Burrus.
Joining us today is Roderick Long. He's professor of philosophy at Auburn University, director and president of the Molinari Institute, a senior fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society, and a regular contributor to libertarianism.org. His new book is Rituals of Freedom, Libertarian Themes in Early Confucianism. Welcome to Free Thoughts.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
So I wanted to start not with Confucianism, but actually with something you mentioned right at the beginning of the book, which may be slightly more familiar to our audience, which is Taoism. A lot of libertarian works, the Libertarian Mind by our colleague David Bowes, for example, begins by saying the earliest libertarian thinker we can see at work in Taoism is Lao Tzu. And you begin by pushing back on that, by saying that's not quite right, that not only is Confucianism a better fit for that, but that the interpretations of Taoism we get from libertarians are not accurate. So can you tell us maybe what Taoism is first and how libertarians get it wrong?
Okay, well, I mean, Taoism and Confucianism are two of the earliest schools of Chinese thought. Exactly how early Lao Tzu is a matter of controversy, because traditionally he's dated to the 6th century BC or thereabouts, which is one reason that, to the extent that he's a libertarian thinker, he's often thought to be the first because he's so early. But the modern view is that probably his book, the Tao Te Ching, dates from something closer to the 4th or 3rd century BC, so that actually it's a little later. So even to whatever extent he is a libertarian, he's not the first. You've got Confucians before him, but certainly there is a strong anti-statist, anti-authoritarian strain in the Taoists. I don't deny that, but there's also a kind of anti-civilization theme in the Taoists. A tendency to think, for example, Lao Tzu says that the ideal society would be one in which people live in little villages and they have lost the art of writing, and so they only keep records by tying knots and string, and they can hear the dogs barking and the roosters crowing in the next village over the hill, but they've never been over there. And more broadly, a kind of suspicion of conceptual thought, the idea that conceptual thought falsifies, that conceptual thought misleads us, that language misleads us, and the idea that we should return to a kind of primitive simplicity, that we should be like an uncarved block. And those are sentiments that most libertarians are not really that into. Most libertarians are fans of language and conceptual abstraction. They're fans of trade and civilization and technology, and so that's a theme. Now the Taoists are complicated, so you can find strands in them that push in other directions. But the two main Taoists, Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, both, at least there is a strong primitivist element in them that may remind us more of Rousseau than of, or one aspect of Rousseau, since he's also complicated. And this kind of primitivist, anti-civilization, anti-rational theme. Now, there are a lot of good things in the Taoists, too. I don't want to just come here and dump on the Taoists, but I think that they are in many ways not as close precursors for libertarianism as the Confucians are.
What type of world, if it was Lao Tzu was in the 3rd or 4th century, as you said, as scholars now think, were they living in for the Taoists, and then also we can talk about this for Confucius, in a state, a kind of thing that we would recognize as a modern state, where maybe even if we apply libertarian concepts to them, we might be doing that illegitimately because they weren't really part of a government, more of a community, for example?
Well, there were, so what had happened, Chinese philosophy arises in the wake of the collapse of the Zhou dynasty. And when you go back to the Zhou dynasty, history starts becoming a little murky. Our recorded history really starts around the time of its collapse. So we don't know that much about the details of the Zhou dynasty, but it collapsed and fragmented. And so you have a period where lots of new little states are popping up. You have various, generals and princes and so forth who are starting, carving out new little states for themselves. So I think they count as states more or less. I mean, they're territorial monopolies, ruled by some jumped up prince or other. And really, Chinese philosophy starts from this because you have all these educators and scholars and bureaucrats who are suddenly, wandering out of a job with the collapse of the previous dynasty, and they are, and they're going to from one to another of these little states, offering their services as political advisors. And so, and two different political advisors show up at the same state, and they want to advise the prince what to do, and so they have to give arguments as to why the prince should listen to him rather than the other one. You start getting debates and so forth, and the early period of Chinese philosophy seems to grow out of that context. So, yeah, I think that it was a context of states, new states, rapidly forming states, competing states in particular that competing for population. These states were, the new states were trying to get people to move from neighboring states to them. It was, they were strongly encouraging immigration because they wanted more workers and more industry and so forth. And so one of the things that these traveling scholars would do is try and give the prince advice about what policies would attract more people into their states.
Well, then I guess let's turn to Confucius then, and maybe so when was he, and give us a bit about his background and character before we get into his thought.
Okay, well, Confucius himself lived around the late 6th, early 5th century BC, and he was one of these displaced scholars who traveled around offering his services. And he started a movement that we call Confucianism. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves by a phrase that means something like the literati is sometimes translated. Confucius himself, Kung Tzu or Confucius, what we have from him, and it's not clear whether it's something he wrote or whether it's something that was assembled by his students. What we have by him is very cryptic and elliptical, and when I talk about Confucianism, really I have in mind less Confucius himself than the people in the next few centuries that came along and developed his thought and considered themselves continuators of Confucius. So I have in mind in particular Mengzi, or Mencius, as he's sometimes called, who was in the 4th century, Shunzi in the 3rd century, and then the historian Sima Qian in the 2nd century. When we're looking for libertarian ideas, that I think it's really in those three above all that we find them. If you trying to figure out, trying to get philosophical ideas out of Confucius himself is tricky. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. Although people have, I think people found them. People have argued that there's a kind of emphasis on voluntary interactions and interactions of respect for other people and suspicion of state power that you get in Confucius himself. But really, I think it's the later Confucians who come after that who are sort of the clearest precursors of libertarianism.
So I wanted to clarify, you said that his students put together his writings for Confucius, so we're not sure, kind of like Aristotle, it sounds, we're not sure what exactly is original to him.
Yeah, and that's the case with a lot of the early thinkers. I mean, a lot of the early thinkers, they have a book, a book or two that'll be their great work, and often each chapter will begin with for example, with Mengzi, each chapter begins, Mengzi said, blah blah blah. On the other with Shunzi, we don't get that anymore. Shunzi might just be sort of his own straight writing in his own words. So as time goes on, we have a clear idea who's doing what. But with the early writings, it's often not clear. And with Lao Tzu, we don't even know. With Lao Tzu, we know virtually nothing about the author.
Well, for another clarification, because I've studied a lot of early Christianity, And I've read a little bit of Confucius, and it is sort of this poetic, elliptical, aphoristic kind of thing. But some of the early types of sayings of Jesus, we see this too, which is interesting by itself. Sort of these wise men speaking in elliptical sentences that maybe later people interpret. But also another
with that we have a lot of scholars think that there's some early collection of Jesus's sayings that different gospels are drawing on, and we don't have the original,
exactly.
The original collection.
But the figure of Confucius himself, did he ever warrant more divine type of respect, more than a philosopher from his followers, or did he always kind of stay a philosopher?
Well, he certainly did not claim any kind of divine or semi-divine status, and I think he would have been, rather upset to find out that later generations started elevating him. The real elevation of him comes, a bit later than this. He's getting sort of later Confucianism. In retrospect, he becomes more and more of a semi-divine, supernatural figure. But in early Confucianism, he's a great teacher. He's very greatly respected. But there's nothing supernatural about the way he's portrayed early on.
So the risk of asking something slightly off topic, but this notion of writing in this elliptical way, an aphoristic way, raises something that I've long wondered about with Eastern philosophy. So while I have you, I'll ask. I've not read a ton of Eastern philosophy, and part of that is because I find it very difficult to read and very difficult to get a mental grasp of in a way that I find relatively straightforward with Western philosophy. And it's that style that it feels like. And so tell me if this is like an accurate characterization, for one, that the writing does seem to be more aphorisms and metaphor and poetic, as opposed to like the treatises that you get from, say, the ancient Greeks, where it's, I'm going to make an argument and here's the steps and I'm going to give support and I'm going to deal with objections, and it looks like a traditional argumentative form. And Eastern philosophy, I've read a decent amount of like Buddhist writings, and it's a similar thing. It's like it's much more slippery and it's harder to see exactly what the arguments are versus the kind of poetic images. Is that accurate at all?
I think that perception is an artifact of the fact that Westerners who are interested in Eastern philosophy are usually looking for something different from Western philosophy. And so the texts that are best known in the West tend to be the more poetic, aphoristic ones. But you can find in both Chinese and Indian philosophy, you can find treatises that are full of arguments and logic chopping and so forth. The kind of stuff that Western philosophers love. Is just that those have not been the texts that have been the most popular in the West, precisely because people were looking for something else. But I think, for example, in China, there's a philosopher named Mozi, who's kind of a utilitarian, semi-utilitarian, semi-contractarian thinker, and his works are just straight argument up and down. But that's one reason that he hasn't been that popular in the West, or in China either, really, because he sort of became eclipsed by the Confucians and the Taoists.
So Westerners are looking for sort of cliches of Chinese thought, and they find them if that's all they're looking for.
Yeah, they want the things that look like a fortune cookie,
or like the guy who gives the mogwai to the guy in Gremlins, like that's Chinese philosophers, right? You actually write that this kind of surprised me, that the spontaneous order, the sort of Hayekian or at least Scottish Enlightenment kind of idea, seems to have originated, or arguably was first articulated in the Confucian tradition. How does that work?
Well, there's this line in Confucianism that for the way for the emperor to rule is simply for him to to hold still and let everything happen around him, which the Taoists say too, and that is a spontaneous order idea from the Taoists, but the Confucians seem to have said it first. And so the idea is that if things are properly set up, you don't need to be tinkering with them and micromanaging them. Now the Confucians think that a lot of what happens can be done through moral inspiration. If you're a morally inspiring leader, you don't actually have to go around giving orders. You just sit there and moral inspiration emanates from you, and that inspires people to go do stuff on their own. But also, a lot of the Confucians, some of the Confucians talk about spontaneous order being created by market incentives. They were fascinated, in particular, Mengzi and Sima Qian, those two, were fascinated by market relations and by the way in which, without any central planning, goods from all over the world end up traveling. The people are able to enjoy stuff that came from the distant north and south and east and west. Simply as a result of market incentives. So that's not a moral inspiration case. The moral inspiration case is sort of the more famous thing that people know about Confucianism. But you also find this thing of just thinking that market relations are really cool for this ability to produce order without anyone planning it.
So were they free market people, like as we would understand that today?
I think Sima Qian comes pretty close. Mengzi has a mixture of sort of free market and non-free market ideas, but Sima Qian, in Sima Qian you find this kind of this praise of entrepreneurs. It sounds almost a mix of Kerzner and Rand, and in his enthusiasm for the ability of entrepreneurs to identify profit opportunities and so forth. And you also find in Sima Qian a lot of criticism of government regulations. There's also a text called the Discourses of Salt and Iron, which is a record of a debate during the early Han Dynasty between the Confucians and the legalists about government policy, and the legalists were sort of constructivist, bureaucratic, top-down micromanagers who wanted to unify everything under common standards and so forth, and regulate everything. And the Confucians are saying this is. All these regulations have piling up the taxes, and the regulations have impoverished the people, and they're supposed to be causing order, but they're just causing chaos. They just ease up, leave them alone, and let people do what they want to do, and that will produce wealth and prosperity and peace. So there's strong libertarian themes there, even if they probably wouldn't. They might not. They might not check off every box on the libertarian quiz precisely as we might want, but they were definitely headed in that direction.
Now, where are they coming from in terms of ethically? If we were to put them into a Western philosophical school for why they're supporting these free markets, or at least observing that they work. I mean, they could be just completely observational and saying, hey, these markets work. But it sounds like they're supporting them. Are they basically consequentialists, or is it sort of a harmony kind of thing? I don't mean to completely bottle up Chinese philosophy with the word harmony as a Westerners want to do. Or is there like a rights theory undergirding this in some way?
Well, they were critical of certainly there are consequentialist aspects to their thought, but they're critical of the consequentialism of the Moists and the Yangists. So to oversimplify a little bit, the Moists were sort of universalist utilitarians who said you should do whatever is best for everyone, universal benefit. And the Yangists were egoists and said you should do whatever is best for your own personal benefit. And the Confucians didn't like either of these accounts. They thought they were too end justifies the means kind of approaches. They the closest, parallel, lots of differences, but the closest parallel would be sort of the virtue theory you find with Plato and Aristotle. This idea of the right way to act is a way that expresses the virtues, expresses what it means to be a properly functioning human being with the right sorts of attitudes. The Confucians also place a very strong emphasis on tradition, and this is one reason that they're often thought of as being closer to conservatism than to libertarianism. Of course, it depends on the details and the mood and so forth. Certainly, we're very strongly traditionalist. They thought that tradition embodied a kind of historical wisdom. They were suspicious of innovation. Now, you can take that in the Hayekian direction, where it looks more compatible with libertarianism, or you can take it in a more conservative direction, and you could find those impulses pushing both ways in Confucianism. But they thought of tradition as sort of the oil of civilization. That tradition is what enables us to interact without compulsion. The fact that we share these common traditions that give a kind of a grace to our interactions.
One of the maybe stereotypes of Confucianism, though, is this. So they're steeped in tradition, but also have a really strong sense of social hierarchy that would seem to cut against a libertarian interpretation.
Yes, they certainly were more into social hierarchy than we would like. They wanted the social hierarchy not to be maintained by coercion, but nevertheless, they certainly were into it. They had their version of the golden rule says, basically treat your ruler the way you would want your subordinate to treat you. Treat your subordinate the way you'd want your ruler to treat you. Treat your parents the way you'd want your children to treat you. So it's like that. So they have these relations of reciprocity, but they build in this hierarchy into it, and that's a less libertarian aspect of them. On the other hand, they also think that when people act unvirtuously in fulfilling their social roles, they lose the title to that respect of the role. So, for example, in Mengsa, there's a little exchange where the prince is talking with Mengsa about some prince in a rival state who was overthrown and killed by the people, and the prince says, "Well, surely you don't think it's okay to kill the prince, do you?" And Mengsa says, "Well, a prince is someone who rules properly. I heard that they executed some common criminal, but I don't consider that they executed a prince. In other words, if you don't act the way a prince is supposed to act, you no longer have title to be considered a prince."
I mean, that seems pretty hardcore.
Yeah, that's completely hardcore. Do they have some sort of view of the illegitimacy of power? Because I'm trying to also imagine the empires that they lived in. You said the Han Dynasty, for example. The rulers of these dynasties, were they divine right of kings kind of situation? Did they have a skepticism toward government power that also let them believe in markets more? For example, did they have views on taxation, that it could be wrong or illegitimate in some way, that just because they thought the state wasn't fully powerful, imbued with godlike powers?
Well, Confucians tended to favor low taxation. They never say that they're against it entirely. They had this idea of a roughly 10% taxation should be the maximum.
So there's like Herman Cain, like the 999 program. We didn't actually know where Herman Cain was getting that, and now we figured it out. We really sold him short. Yeah,
I thought it was Pokemon that he got it from.
Okay, that too. Yes.
Yeah, that was just slightly to the east of China. But so the context here is so we have the collapse of the Zhou dynasties. You've got all these new little states popping up. It's called the Warring States period. Then you have a brief period where China is united under the Qin dynasty. Really brief. It was like 15 years. This was a period when the legalists that I mentioned before, the top-down micromanagers, became the dominant ideology. that's the Qin dynasty is the one that well, they often say it built the Great Wall of China. Now, what we have now is, what we have now is a later, a later addition to that wall. But I mean, they built the original first Great Wall of China, and also, the famous imperial tomb with all the terracotta warriors, that's from the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty was overthrown. And it's sort of a nice story about how it was overthrown, which was the legalists had this view that light offenses should be punished just as heavily as major ones, because the idea is, well, you want to prevent all offenses, not just the major ones, and so all offenses, major or minor, should be treated really severely. So there was this group of soldiers that was supposed to be making their way from point A to point B, and they had to go through this swampy area, and they realized they were going to be late for the point they're supposed to show up at. The penalty for being late was death. And so they said, well, what's the penalty for trying to overthrow the government? Death. Well, we're definitely going to be late, so they had no incentive not to. No, so this is like.
Well, we were going to do that. We might as well overthrow the government.
This is like the worry that the libertarians have raised about 3 strikes you're out laws, which is if you're. If I'm going to rob you and it's my 3rd strike, and I might as well kill you to get rid of the witness, since there's no worse penalty for that than for robbing. Anyway, so if the Qin dynasty gets overthrown and they bring in a new dynasty, the Han dynasty, so we do get a unified China. And of course, when I say unified China, the area that's unified is much smaller than what is China today, but what they would have considered unified. So the early Confucians are writing, during the Warring States period, before the unification. Then Sima Qian, the historian, he's writing afterward, and these discourses of salt and iron, about the salt and iron monopolies, is written during the early Han. So the early Han is, the Confucians all agree that it's an improvement on the Qin. The Qin was a particularly oppressive regime. According to the Confucians, the Qin dynasty burned lots of books and buried scholars alive. Historians are debate as to how much of that is true and how much of that is just the next dynasty telling nasty stories about the previous one. But still, it does look as though if you look at who the political advisors were and you read what the kind of things the political advisors advocate, you think, well, it probably was pretty bad, whether or not it was as bad as they say. So the early Confucians are writing during a period when China's not yet unified, and the later ones are writing, after it has been. Of course, they all wanted it to be unified. Most of the Chinese philosophers, it's kind of like Renaissance Italy, where all the theorists are talking, won't it be wonderful when we finally get unified. Part of the reason they wanted this unification and centralization is that they thought it would end the warfare among the states. But the Confucians didn't want unification to be done by military conquest, which is what the legalists were doing. They wanted it to be done by in effect through competition, by having the successful rulers be imitated, having the successful rulers have everyone else come and want to join them and want to be ruled by them rather than whoever else they were being ruled by. So they had this vision of China becoming unified through a kind of competition in good ruling.
So if they thought that there should be competition between rulers and that you should just move to the one who's doing a better job, and then if he starts doing a worse job, up and leave to somewhere else, that rulers were fairly constrained because if they weren't ruling properly, then they weren't rulers in the first place. They were fans of trade, fans of markets, opposed to coercion. They sound an awful lot like market anarchists. Yeah,
the problem, though, is that they wanted the competition to end with the best one winning. In other words, they thought they didn't think of the competition as an ongoing way of maintaining order. Although sometimes they begin to look like they're moving in that direction, but most of the time they think that the competition is a way for the best rulers to end up in charge, and so you'll eventually have all China reunified under the best rulers. So they thought of competition as having an end point where the best one wins and then you're done.
That seems almost Nozikian, and like overlapping security agencies, one single big one emerges due to efficiencies in the process.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, and I do. I think that they were assuming that. I mean, they were. I remember that the Confucians are coming. They or their predecessors had been, minor functionaries in the Zhou dynasty, and they had it pretty good. And then came all the social chaos and the fragmentation into all these fighting states, and so a lot of them, I think, just assumed that the best result was unification again. I don't think that they really thought of. There was something that's an alternative to both of those things. On the other hand, Sima Qian is a big fan of these. There were these private vigilantes who were sort of half bandits and half freelance cops.
Batman. You should have said
Yeah.
Batman, just for Aaron. We always have to put Batman as much as we
They were
can.
Batman. Anyway, he had he's a big fan of them, and they would offer their protective services to various people, and he has perhaps a more romanticized image of them than may be accurate. Maybe Robin Hood is the sort of the closest thing. Robin Hood in the Batman costume. But anyway, that's his enthusiasm for them is sort of in entrepreneurs in rights protection is a you see that's an anarchist strand in his thought, even if he doesn't.
Do we have any
carry
idea?
through.
Do we have any idea how many people in normal people living in China at the time? Because the Confucians, the ones we're talking about, they were occupying governmental roles mostly, or were they professional intellectuals? What were they actually doing?
Well, they were initially they were going from state to state trying to become officials. Once the Han Dynasty gets started, then you ended up with a sort of bureaucratic class of Confucians, although the legalists were still around too as a bureaucratic class, and there was competition within them. So yeah, they're either state officials or they're trying to become state officials for the most part.
Are they teaching it? I mean, the universities? Because I want to know how many people, normal people, like the guy selling fruit in the street, was a Confucian. Would any of those people have been like, no, I'm a Confucian? Another person would have been like, no, I'm a legalist. Was that where the debate was also happening?
The vast majority of the population were peasants. It's not clear whether they were even literate in most cases. So I would guess that the average person had no idea what all this stuff going on. But it's hard to say. The people who whose writings we have don't talk that much about what the average person was doing. No, certainly we find stories about someone arising among the peasantry who's some kind of a wise man or inspirational figure or something, and then various stories and doctrines will get attached to him. But it's hard to know how much of that's history and how much isn't.
I wanted to ask about, you mentioned this thing called the well-field system that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so this is an idea that Mengzi has. It's a system where you have a grid of a grid of 9 squares, like a tic-tac-toe. That's why it's called the well-field system, because it has nothing to do with an actual well. It's just that the Chinese character, the symbol for well, looks kind of like a tic-tac-toe. And so you have 8 private farms centered around the central common square. So the idea is that the people all work on their individual. Each family has its own individual farm. Then the families together all cultivate the common farm, and then the taxes are paid to the state from the common farm, not from the private ones. So immediately it looks like there's a serious free rider problem here, because if the taxes are paid from the common farm, it seems like you have incentive to spend most of your time cultivating your private farm and not cultivating the common one. So a lot of people thought, well, Mengzi seems to have bad economic ideas here, but Mengzi says his reason for the system is to limit taxation. It's to make it, at least that's one reason for it, it's to make it harder for the state to tax people by saying that they can only tax the common farm. So I think that the free rider aspect is sort of part of what he wants. That is to say, you're not going to spend a lot of time cultivating the common farm unless you really feel pretty patriotic and pretty, you're pretty inspired by the existing regime and you actually want to give it some kind of support. So it's a way of making taxation, as I see it, is a way of making taxation contingent on the rulers doing a good job of inspiring the people and getting their support. And so it's actually a way of giving the people a kind of veto power on what the state is doing, and if the less inspired they are by what the state is doing, the less inspired they are to spend much of the time working on the common plot, and so the less taxes the state gets. That's that. No, Mengzi doesn't say that explicitly, but that's sort of my the impression I'm getting from what it's about.
Listening to all this and having read all this, the thing that struck me today is that this seems like a fairly individualist philosophy, and a lot of times, and maybe this is just Western ignorance or my own ignorance, but when we think about China today and a lot of the East, we don't really think about individualist philosophies carrying much weight. They're far more communitarian in their discussion of society and the value of community. Did Confucianism change? I mean, first of all, is it accurate to call it a pretty individualist philosophy? And then has it changed to a more communitarian as it evolved into modern times?
Well, it depends what exactly you mean by those words, because there's a sense in which the Confucians were always very communitarian. They're very social. They think that your proper role as a human being has to do with your participating in these very social relations. Of course, that's not necessarily inconsistent with individualism. I mean, Hayek certainly wouldn't think so, for example. And often it's Hayek that one is reminded of in reading some of this stuff, because if you want an example of someone who combines strong individualism with a kind of communitarian traditionalism, because is Hayek an individualist or is he a communitarian? Well, there are aspects of both.
But it's interesting when he's like limiting taxation, for example, these kind of things where it would seem, but the reason you would do that is because you care about the individual, one of the reasons, not wanting to take too much from them. Whereas if you were saying the community, you wouldn't have a view of limiting taxation. You'd just say, no, as much as the community needs, kind of thing.
Well, I think they're thinking of the rulers you could think of it this way: the rulers are taking money from the community, and there's the rulers are supposed to have the interests of the community at heart. But if they're taxing all these people, all the people together are the community, and the rulers are individuals extracting money from the community. So
true. So maybe I completely mischaracterized it, but the part of the question I said is Confucianism today, is it different in a meaningful, because it is still pretty popular religion if I remember correctly. Yeah,
well, I think certainly Confucianism has made its peace with with state power a lot more than it had in those days, and I think you can sort of see the process, because initially the Confucians are trying to get political influence, but eventually they get it. Eventually they become a privileged bureaucratic class within the state, and becoming a privileged bureaucratic class within the state does tend to alter your incentives. So I think the Confucians are at their best during the period when they still have to compete for influence with rival schools. Once they become sort of the established monopoly within the state, I think then, although there are interesting continuities with the earlier tradition, they become, for one thing, much less fans of trade, because the early Confucians, especially people like Mengzi and Sima Qian, were really fans of trade and commerce, and they're really impressed by the fact that economic incentives were bringing these goods from all over the world. Where later on, the Confucians become very suspicious of trade and travel and interaction with foreign cultures, and in effect, they end up sort of clamping down on China's economic relations with other countries, because there's that period when the Chinese are sending these giant ships all over the world, and the Confucians were against all that. They're against these trade things. The later Confucians were. So I think that the Confucians lose a lot of their libertarian edge when they become a professional class or privileged class within the state.
So given how strong this libertarian edge appears to be for at least the early Confucians, why is it that they then seem to get as little play as they do from modern libertarians? And when we're discussing the history of liberty, I mean, going back to the beginning, like the Taoists get mentioned fairly frequently as earlier proto-libertarians, and the Confucius don't. But if they were this strongly libertarian, why don't we see more of them?
Well, again, I'm not sure. I mean, most Westerners who've read any Chinese philosophy, have probably read, Lao Tzu and some Confucius, maybe. So they, not that many Westerners, have read these other thinkers. I guess Mencius, a fair number of people have read him, but a lot of cases they're just not that well known. And Sima Qian, is not as widely read as he ought to be. His history is just a fascinating.
So why should our listeners read them then? Other than what you've said, I mean, you've mentioned a bunch of it today, but what additional thing do they bring to the libertarian tradition?
Well, it's a contribution that isn't quite the same as either the rights-based Lockean approach or the utilitarian approach or the Randian egoist approach. It's just it's another approach that has some things in common with those other things, but it's different. I think one thing that's interesting is that a lot of people tend to think that libertarianism is a distinctively Western value, and that it's not appropriate for Asian cultures and so on. By pointing out some of the aspects of this tradition, you can show that it isn't just a Western thing. Now, I start off with this tendentious quote from Ludwig von Mises at the beginning of the book. It says, "The idea of liberty is and has always been peculiar to the West. What separates East and West is first of all the fact that the peoples of the East never conceived the idea of liberty. The East lacked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state." And I quoted that because that's something that a lot of people believe, not just Mises. I think that its products are simply not reading enough of the things people ought to be reading.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Free Thoughts is produced by Evan Banks and Mark McDaniel. To learn more, find us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.